From quick errands to long runs, the cold cases included in this episode feature stories of victims who set out on foot and never returned home. Each of these little-known cases is in critical need of tips from the public, so join us as we retrace the final steps of 4 separate victims in this special multi-case episode of Last Seen Alive. Stories in this episode include the 1979 murder of North Carolina college student Tammy Aldridge, who went for a run while visiting home during a break and was waylaid by a cruel killer. The 1981 disappearance of small-town Pennsylvania teenager Michele Reidenbach, who walked just a block away from her place of work on an errand and vanished without a trace. The 1990 cold case murder of Jennifer Bailey, who set out for a jog on a popular Kentucky running trail only to be fatally attacked by a man who has remained unidentified for more than 30 years. And the 2011 murder of 23-year-old David Grubbs, who was brutally attacked and killed while walking along an Oregon bike path on his way home from work. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
As always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
This year, Scott and I have decided to add something new to our episode lineup, something that will allow us to cover more cold cases in serious need of tips. We'll still be putting out our regular single case episodes every other Monday. Nothing has changed in that regard. But in addition to that, every quarter we'll be releasing an extra episode that includes 3 to 4 cold cases told back to back. We aired our first extra episode in this style in December of 2023 on the podcast's 4th anniversary. We used Spotify's Q&A feature to ask those of you who listen on that platform whether you'd like to hear more extra episodes in this format, and the vast majority of you who replied said yes. So we'll be airing 4 of these special episodes in 2024, 1 for each quarter of the year. That way we can cover up to a dozen more cold cases over the course of the year. Each of the stories in these episodes will be a little shorter than the cases we cover in our regular episodes, and that's simply because there isn't as much information out there on these cases. These are cases that are, by and large, little known outside of the localities in which they occurred. In some cases, the majority of people living in the places where they occurred may not even be aware of them. So please, if you have any information on any of these cases, let investigators know. We'll include contact information for the appropriate investigating agencies at the conclusion of each story, as usual. And now, on to our first case. A quick heads up, this segment contains mention of sexual assault. Please listen with care, and if you prefer not to hear about the subject, we recommend skipping ahead to today's second segment, which tells Michele Reidenbach's story. Tammy Aldridge was last seen alive on June 30th, 1979. She was 20 years old at the time and was a student at Central Piedmont Community College in Charlotte, North Carolina, where she was studying physical therapy. She'd grown up in another part of the state just outside the small city of Burlington, which at the time was home to about 66,000 people and was located nearly a 2-hour drive northeast of Charlotte. So, while attending college, Tammy didn't live at home. She did visit frequently, though. And the summer of 1979 was one of those times. Classes were out for the season, and so she returned home to the Burlington area to enjoy time with her parents and sisters. Tammy was friendly, outspoken, had a green thumb, and was athletic. She was a runner and had a route that she routinely jogged down Deep Creek Church Road, which is a rural road just past the outskirts of the city. It winds through wooded areas and past a few homes and fields. The road was close to the Aldridge family home, so it was a convenient running route for her. Before she left for her routine run on the day of her disappearance, there was nothing unordinary about the day. She and her mom had gone grocery shopping that morning, then they'd picked some squash from their garden which they planned to use in a casserole. After that, Tammy and her little sister laid out in the backyard, sun-tanning for a while before coming inside. Tammy took a nap, and when she woke up later that afternoon, she threw on some athletic clothing over her swimsuit. She had plans for later in the evening that she was looking forward to. It was a Saturday, and she'd be going on a date with her boyfriend, a local young man named Freddie. It was nothing at all out of the ordinary when Tammy left for her jog, telling her mom, Shelby, that she'd be back later, and asking her to let her know if Freddie called while she was gone. Tammy jogged the same route every time, so Shelby knew when to expect her back. When she didn't return at the expected time, she started to wonder why, but she had a theory. They had several elderly relatives who lived in the vicinity, and Tammy was well known for helping them out whenever they needed with whatever they needed. It was easily conceivable that Tammy might have stopped at one of their homes to lend them a hand with some kind of chore. She'd always been generous with her time and energy, especially when it came to the elderly. However, when several hours passed and she hadn't returned, Shelby knew that something was wrong. She'd called all their nearby relatives and friends, and none of them had seen Tammy. Plus, she knew that Tammy wouldn't have ghosted her boyfriend, who she'd had a fun evening out planned with. And Shelby was, unfortunately, right. 3 days later, Tammy's body would be found. But in the interim, the 3 days in between Tammy's disappearance and the discovery of her body, Shelby would hear from her daughter.
Okay, I'm a little surprised by that.
It's unusual, but it's one of those cases. According to a 1985 article published in the News and Record newspaper, Tammy's family received a phone call on Sunday, July 1st, which was the day after her disappearance. And that phone call was from Tammy. During the call, Tammy told her mom that she was all right, but couldn't tell her where she was. She also asked her mom to tell Freddie that she loved him. After that, the line suddenly went dead, as if someone had forced her to hang up.
I would have expected if they'd reached out in some manner or form for there to be some sort of ransom and for it to be some sort of proof of life.
Yeah, you might think so, and I suppose you could say this was proof of life, but there was never any demand for a ransom. It was never clear what the point of the phone call was. Now, this call alarmed investigators who already believed that Tammy had been kidnapped. After her family had reported her missing, investigators had deployed to her usual running route with a tracking canine. According to a 2012 article for the Burlington Times-News, the canine had followed Tammy's scent trail to its end, and where it had ended, they'd found disturbances in the gravel plus tire tracks. It looked as if someone had forced Tammy into their vehicle. So, when Tammy's family received a call from her, they immediately took action and tapped the Aldridge family's phone line in hopes that Tammy's captor would permit her to call back again. If they could manage to trace the call, they could potentially determine her location. And Tammy did call back a second time the following night. The second call was brief, so brief, unfortunately, that investigators weren't able to trace it. They were, however, able to at least record the conversation. During the second call, Tammy told her mom that she loved her and the rest of the family. She asked her to tell her dad that she loved him too. Like she had during the first call, she said again that she was all right, but couldn't say where she was. She assured her mom, however, that she would be home soon, and before she could say much more, she said that she had to hang up. That was the last time Tammy's family ever heard from her. In an article for the Burlington Times-News, Tammy's mom, Shelby, is quoted saying that the call was such a blessing. She believed Tammy's assurances that she'd be home soon, so much so that she stayed up all night, eagerly waiting for Tammy to walk in. She was convinced that it would happen at any moment, even as the nighttime hours ticked by. The following morning, the sun rose without any sign of Tammy at the family home. Elsewhere in the county, a motorist driving along a rural road made a horrifying discovery. Tammy's body had been abandoned in the middle of the road.
Middle of the road.
Yes, clearly somewhere where they wanted it to be quickly found. When investigators responded to the scene, they could tell by the temperature of Tammy's body that she was only recently deceased. She was clothed in the same blue satin running shorts and striped top she'd been wearing when she left for her final run, but her shorts were on backward and her shirt was inside out. Her running shoes and the bathing suit she'd been wearing under her clothes were missing, but investigators would later find those items laying along another stretch of the road. Her ankles were bound with rope, and according to a 1985 article published in the Herald Sun, marks on her wrists indicated that she'd been bound there at some point as well. Marks on her neck indicated that she had died of manual strangulation. An autopsy would confirm that fact, as well as the fact that she'd been sexually assaulted.
It seems like her attacker and kidnapper was just trying to dispose of her remains quickly.
That's possible, but also by leaving her in the middle of the road, not even off to the side in some brush, I really do think that he wanted her to be found, and he wanted her to be found quickly. For some killers, they get a thrill out of that. They want people to see what they've done, and I think that may have been the case here.
If that was the case, I wonder if he stuck around somewhere in the area to watch to see how long it took somebody to find her.
That's very possible. Naturally, Tammy's community was horrified by the news of what had happened to her. There had never been a crime like it in the area, and people were scared. Local police launched an investigation, but it would be half a dozen years before they publicly named a suspect. And actually, when the time finally came, they did more than just name him. They indicted him on murder charges. In a grand jury hearing that occurred in July of 1985, a man named Paul Teague was indicted on charges of kidnapping, rape, and murder in relation to Tammy's death. Teague lived in San Jose, California, but had moved there approximately 5 years beforehand, so about a year after Tammy's murder. Before relocating to California, he'd lived in the Burlington, North Carolina area, approximately 2 to 3 miles from where Tammy's body had been found. He'd only been 16 or 17 years old at the time of her death. As for why investigators believed Teague had killed Tammy, well, at first, that wasn't publicly known. Grand jury hearings are secretive, and police weren't saying much publicly. But when Teague went to trial, the details were, of course, let out of the bag. According to a 1985 article about the trial from the Herald-Sun, investigators had located 2 witnesses who had reported to them that Teague had told them he'd murdered Tammy. They also claimed that 2 other men named Frank and Tony had been involved. However, by the time they came forward with these claims, Frank was dead, having been fatally shot in an unrelated crime, and Tony, well, investigators were never able to figure out who he might have been or even whether he had ever existed.
I'm not surprised.
Anyway, the witness's story went like this. Allegedly, Tammy had been jogging along her usual route when Teague had come along in a vehicle. He'd invited Tammy to a party, and she'd agreed and had hopped into his vehicle voluntarily without making any effort to inform her family that she wouldn't be returning home. Later, at the party, she'd had consensual sex with Teague and also the mysterious Tony. However, at some point afterward, she'd become hysterical, and Teague had allegedly bound and gagged her to keep her quiet. And then she'd accidentally died as a result of being bound and gagged. Subsequently, Teague had disposed of her body.
Okay, that leaves a lot of unanswered questions.
It also leaves a lot of holes in the story. For starters, as Teague's defense attorneys pointed out, none of the physical evidence implicated Teague. And actually, the physical evidence doesn't even implicate Tammy accidentally dying at all. We know, thanks to physical evidence, that she didn't suffocate as a result of being bound and gagged. She died of manual strangulation. Someone had literally squeezed the life out of her with their bare hands, and that does not happen by accident.
No, and it also doesn't account for the phone calls.
No. Of course, one could argue, okay, what if Teague did kill Tammy, and when he told people about what he'd done, he falsified the details of what had gone down in order to make himself sound like less of a monster, claiming that Tammy had voluntarily gone with him to the party, consensually engaged in sex with him, and then accidentally died when really he'd abducted, sexually assaulted, and intentionally murdered her.
That seems a lot more likely.
I think so too, but the problem with that theory is simply that there was no evidence to support it. The only real evidence investigators had was the word of their 2 witnesses. And there was a problem with that too. One of the witnesses was a guy named Charles Lowry, who had been Teague's boss at the time of Tammy's death. He claimed to have hosted the party where this had all gone down. And, by the way, the house where he'd allegedly hosted this party was located close to the site of where Tammy's body had been discovered. The other witness was a guy named Bobby Lynch. And both of these men, Lowry and Lynch, were criminals facing serious drug charges not at the local level, but the federal level, which meant that they were facing the overwhelming likelihood of serious prison time. They were both incarcerated when they told investigators about Teague's alleged role in Tammy's death, and they then entered into, quote, an agreement with federal authorities for concessions on sentences in their cases in return for testifying in the trial of Teague, end quote, according to that 1985 Herald-Sun article about the trial.
Okay, so honestly, I'm shocked that investigators even attempted to go forward with something this loose.
You know, I was surprised by it too. Maybe there's more to it that wasn't reported that I don't know about that made them interested. Or maybe they were just so desperate to figure out who had committed this terrible crime that had the whole town terrified and traumatized that they went with it. I don't know, but yeah, I was surprised.
There's just so many holes in that story. I mean, I know law enforcement agencies go with untrustworthy and loose accounts of events sometimes, but to pin your whole case on that?
Yeah, that story really is a piece of Swiss cheese, and it didn't work out in court. So, needless to say, the witnesses had major motivation to lie about Teague's involvement. Additionally, when an autopsy had been performed, no alcohol or drugs of any kind had been found in Tammy's blood. So the witnesses' claims that Tammy had been drinking and doing drugs at the party couldn't be true.
Yeah, like I said, it leaves a lot more questions than it answers, which is not something I'd want to take to court.
No, me neither. As for Teague, he denied all of the allegations against him. He'd never encountered Tammy that day, didn't know her, had never partied with her, engaged with her sexually, and had certainly never harmed her. Unsurprisingly, the case against him disintegrated under scrutiny in the courtroom. He was ultimately not convicted of any of the charges against him, which left investigators back at the drawing board.
The last thing I have on this is you don't get redos in cases like that. So even if there was evidence to support this claim, going on the basis of you have these two highly motivated witnesses to assist with whatever they came up with, even if you did have something later on the line that did implicate him, it's not like you get a redo at that.
Yeah, not in the U.S. thanks to the concept of double jeopardy, which is illegal. They didn't just charge Teague with Tammy's murder. They charged him with her murder, with abducting her, and with her rape. Now, since he was not found guilty of those things, he can never be charged with any of those crimes again, even if it did turn out that he did it. But to be honest, it doesn't sound like he did it, so I'm not too worried about it. But yeah, a lot of decisions were made with that prosecution. Now, no one else has been charged in relation to the crimes against Tammy so far, but investigators have looked at other suspects. One such suspect was a North Carolina man named Larry Chappell. Chappell, who'd been in his 40s at the time of Tammy's death, had lived in the same area as Tammy. I wish I could tell you why investigators suspected him in relation to her death, but they haven't revealed that information to the public, and perhaps it doesn't matter. What I can tell you is that Chappell died several years after Tammy in the 80s. However, in 2007, investigators exhumed his remains in order to obtain a DNA sample. They believed he might have killed Tammy and wanted to compare his DNA against DNA they'd collected from Tammy's body. On that note, the medical examiner had located sperm in Tammy's body, which was possibly the source of the DNA they intended to compare Chappell's against. According to a 2007 article for the Toledo Blade, if the DNA matched, investigators would consider the case finally closed. However, it turned out that the samples did not match. Now, speaking of potential suspects, while I was researching this case, I couldn't help but be reminded of another very well-known case, which most of you listening have probably heard of before. I'm talking about the murder of Sherry Smith by South Carolinian serial killer Larry Gene Bell. It's a well-known tragedy, but to sum it up briefly, Sherry was 17 years old in 1985 when Bell abducted her at gunpoint while she was checking the mail at the end of her own driveway on Platte Springs Road, which is a little ways outside the city of Columbia, South Carolina. After abducting Sherry, Bell made several taunting phone calls to Sherry's family during that time, claiming that she was still alive and that he was holding her captive. Sherry's parents and sister desperately hoped that she would be returned to them, but ultimately Sherry's body was found abandoned behind a Masonic lodge in a rural area nearly 20 miles or 32 kilometers from the Smith family home. Investigators believe that Sherry had likely been killed within 12 hours of being abducted and that she was likely suffocated to death. There was still duct tape on her face when her body was found. Bell went on to victimize several other girls and women, although he was ultimately caught, convicted, imprisoned, and executed for Sherry's murder. Because of the abductions, the phone calls, and his crimes happening in South Carolina, which is of course next door to North Carolina, I couldn't help but think of Sherry's case and Bell's terrible crimes while I researched Tammy's case. And I thought I would be remiss if I didn't raise the subject, since I know many of you listening are likely familiar with Sherry's case and probably noticed the similarities as well. Plus, I did a little research on Bell, and I learned that in the mid-1970s at least, 1975 to be specific, he was actually living in the state of North Carolina, the Charlotte area, where Tammy had gone to school to be exact. Remember, Tammy's case happened in 1979. It's possible that Bell was living in her home state of North Carolina at the time, or that he had at least recently lived there. However, to the best of my knowledge, Bell was not involved in Tammy's case. Because of his notoriety as a serial abductor and killer operating in the Carolinas, I have to assume that investigators explored the possibility of his involvement. And since they have that DNA evidence they recovered from Tammy's body, ruling out Bell as a potential suspect should have been relatively straightforward. In any case, in addition to the similarities between Tammy and Sherry's cases, there are also differences. As for where the investigation into Tammy's murder stands now, Well, it's been more than a decade since her case has made the news, so all I can tell you is that it's still unsolved and that Tammy is still very, very missed by her family. Her father passed away years ago without ever receiving answers, as did the other elderly family members she was known to care for. Other members of her family are still waiting to find out who took Tammy's life. If you know anything about the murder of Tammy Aldridge, please contact the Alamance County Sheriff's Office at 336-570-6300. And now, on to our next case after a short break. I want to begin this next segment by thanking Audrey, who brought it to our attention. As a young woman, Audrey was a friend of the victims, as she puts it, and she's never forgotten her despite the fact that the case received exceedingly little attention from the news media. Audrey reached out to us to suggest that we cover this case, and we appreciate her doing so. Thanks, Audrey. Michele Reidenbach, who friends called Shelley, was last seen alive on September 22, 1981. She was 16 years old at the time and lived in Zelienople, Pennsylvania, a small town of just a few thousand people located about 28 miles or 45 kilometers outside of Pittsburgh. Michele was a senior at Seneca Valley High, and the day of her disappearance had been a highlight of her senior year, Senior Picture Day. Michele and her best friend Beth had been really excited over having senior portraits taken that day, so when Michele woke up that morning feeling a little under the weather, she pushed through and went to school anyway. Michele had her senior photo taken that day, and then, immediately after school, she helped Beth get ready for her photo, which she was having taken that afternoon. Beth worked at a local convenience store, so they retreated to the store's restroom, and Michele helped Beth with her hair and makeup and even lent her some accessories. It was fun, but Michele made sure to wrap up in time to head to her own after-school job. Michele had recently landed a part-time job at a local store called Mel Den TV and Appliance. Her primary role there consisted of addressing envelopes. That was exactly how she planned to spend the majority of that evening, but there was one problem. That cold she'd woken up with that morning had worsened. She realized that if she was going to make it through her shift, she needed medicine. And so she set off on foot for a drugstore located about a block away, telling her boss she was going to use her break to run the errand and that she'd be back. She never returned, but that wasn't the last anyone saw of her. In the early stages of the investigation, investigators went to the drugstore Michele had left for and learned from the cashier that she had, in fact, made it there and had purchased cold medicine as planned. However, she'd never returned to work. When Michele didn't return to the appliance shop, her boss assumed that she'd changed her mind about working while sick and had simply gone home. So no one realized anything was wrong until Michelle's boyfriend arrived at her work to pick her up at the end of her shift, only to realize she wasn't there. This was odd because they'd planned to go on a date that evening. Upon learning that Michele had left work early and hadn't returned, Michelle's boyfriend went to the convenience store where Michelle's best friend, Beth, worked. He hoped that she would know where Michele had gone, but she didn't. Of course, Michelle's boyfriend wasn't the only one who became worried. Michelle's mom also became concerned when Michele failed to return home that night. According to an article for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, at first, Michelle's mom thought that Michele might have spent the night at her best friend Beth's house. That wouldn't have been uncommon, although it would have been unusual for Beth to not call home to let her family know where she was. Still, she hoped that Michele had simply gotten caught up in the excitement of senior photo day and had forgotten. But when she called Beth the following morning, she quickly learned that that hadn't been the case. Upon learning that Michele had not spent the night with her best friend, Michelle's mom immediately contacted local police and reported her missing. Soon after being contacted by Michelle's family, investigators realized that they were not dealing with a typical teenage runaway case. All signs pointed to something more concerning. For starters, she'd left her belongings at the appliance store, her books, and even her purse. Notably, her purse contained her cigarettes, and she was a heavy smoker. It definitely appeared as if she'd intended to return to work like she'd said she was going to. And if she decided not to after all, surely she would have at least popped back in to grab her things.
I mean, it was only a block. It's not that far. It's not that out of the way to just go in and be like, hey, actually, I'm going home and I'm coming to get my things.
Right. And I can't imagine anyone saying, you know what? I don't want to walk a block, so I'm going to leave my wallet, my purse, and my cigarettes all behind. No way. That definitely was a red flag for investigators. Additionally, investigators talked to Michelle's family and learned that she had recently been saving up some cash in order to purchase a class ring. She had $100 set aside at home in her bedroom. That's the equivalent of $335 in today's money, so a pretty good chunk of change for a high schooler. Investigators believed that if Michele had planned to run away, she would have taken the cash she'd saved up with her, but nothing about her disappearance seemed planned. A quick side note here regarding Michele's belongings being left at her place of work. In the interest of considering all possibilities, I suppose it's hypothetically plausible that Michele did make it back to work after buying the cold medicine and that something had happened to her there in the appliance shop. However, to the best of my knowledge, no evidence has arisen to suggest this. Investigators also noted that Michele had a solid, stable home life. She was the youngest of 7 children and had close relationships with her family, especially her oldest sister. Speaking of her oldest sister, she was 31, and a couple months earlier, the entire Reidenbach family had been taken by surprise when she'd suffered a stroke. The stroke had been so serious that it had partially paralyzed her and had left her hospitalized for about 2 months. During that time, Michele had visited her in the hospital every single day. At the time of Michele's disappearance, things had started looking up for her sister. She'd graduated from that initial phase of hospital stabilization and had been admitted into a rehabilitation program. For those who knew Michele, it was inconceivable that she would have left her family, especially her sister, who was going through such a difficult time and to whom she was so close, behind. During her sister's hospitalization, she hadn't even been willing to go a single day without visiting her. So, investigators knew that they had 2 important questions to answer, not just where Michele had gone, but who had taken her there. Investigators spoke to those who had interacted with Michele on the day of her disappearance and quickly learned that her boss, a man named Fred, had seen her one final time after she'd gone to the drugstore. According to what he told police, he'd seen her in the parking lot of the supermarket next door. She'd been speaking with an unidentified man in a red car. This was the last reported sighting of Michele, and it's unknown whether it had anything to do with her disappearance. Michele was friendly, and it's possible that she'd simply stopped to chat with someone she knew. Almost everything about Michele's case remains a mystery now, more than 40 years later. No trace of her has ever been found despite the efforts of police and of her family. Now, Michele's mom, for one, was willing to try just about anything to locate her. She told a reporter for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette that, quote, "I visited a fortune teller to see if there was some lead we could follow. I don't even know if I believe in that sort of thing, but it's just getting too long and you start to think too many dumb things," end quote. Of course, she wasn't dumb, just desperate to find her youngest child who had inexplicably vanished. She even went so far as to bring in a psychic to work with the police, but to no avail. She also tried really hard to get Michele's case featured on national TV shows like Unsolved Mysteries in hopes that the exposure would result in answers. However, for whatever reason, producers never selected her story to be featured. To the immense disappointment of her mother, Michele's case never received national attention. The only news outlets that covered her story were local, and that's still the case. Years went by with no answers. Local people called in tips, wanting to help, especially at first, but the information they provided never led to resolution. In 1981, the same year Michele went missing, another teenage girl named Christine Gunther went missing from a neighboring county. Her remains were discovered by hunters 5 days later. Presumably, she'd been abducted while walking on her way to a doctor's appointment. At some point afterward, she'd been bludgeoned to death, and her killer had attempted to conceal her body in the woods a few miles away from where she disappeared from. Because of the proximity to Zelienople and the similarities, some have wondered whether Christine and Michele might have been targeted by the same offender. Unfortunately, Christine's murder remains unsolved as well, so even if that was the case, we don't know who that offender was. In 1989, 8 years after Michele went missing, investigators expressed interest in questioning a man named David E. Neal in relation to Michele's case. Neal had been living in Zelienople at the time of Michele's disappearance, but by the time 1989 rolled around, he was incarcerated, serving time on a murder conviction. Here's what happened. According to a 1988 article in the Pittsburgh Press, then 29-year-old Neal, who had gone by many aliases, including but not limited to Mickey Accardo, the Snake Man, and Mr. Chicago, had gone out for a night on the town, bar hopping in Pittsburgh. He did this outfitted in a costume reminiscent of those worn by stage actors in the iconic Broadway musical, Cats.
How dare he?
Yeah, it starts out sounding funny, but it took a very dark turn. At some point during the night, Neal, still in his Cats costume, solicited services from a transgender sex worker. They were 28 years old and went by Tony. Neal stabbed them to death. That was the crime that landed Neal in prison in 1988. Because Neal was a known murderer, and because he'd been living in the same general area as Michele at the time of her disappearance, investigators at one point considered the possibility of him being involved in Michele's case. According to a 1989 article from the Pittsburgh Press, investigators were, at the time, interested in speaking to Neil regarding Michele's case. Whether or not they ever did that, I'm not certain. However, as Michele's mom pointed out in that same article, there was no evidence linking Neil with her daughter's case, and there was no real similarity between the cases either. It seems that investigators were just trying to explore all possibilities. In 1993, a dozen years after Michele went missing, local and state investigators established a task force to focus on her case, which had gone all but cold in recent years. At the time, they were optimistic that Michele's case could be solved. The Butler County District Attorney told the Allegheny Times that, quote, "We have looked into this case and we feel we have a high chance of positive resolution," end quote. According to a 1993 article for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, investigators had obtained new information regarding Michele's case. However, that information has never been publicly disclosed, so I can't tell you what it was. I can tell you that the task force included Pennsylvania state troopers who re-interviewed the people who had immediately been questioned after Michele's disappearance. The task force came and eventually went, with their investigative efforts never producing the resolution they'd hoped for. As the years wore on, Michele's parents passed away without ever learning what had happened to her. So eventually did her boyfriend, the one she'd planned to go on a date with on the evening of the day she'd vanished. Michele, who was the youngest in a large family, is still remembered and missed by her siblings and by friends. Even though her case never received the attention it deserved outside of her corner of Pennsylvania, she hasn't been forgotten there. Investigators are still pursuing answers, but they need more information. In a 2023 interview with journalist Molly Miller for the Butler Eagle, Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Casey said that, quote, "We receive a tip every couple of years. We have followed up on a few leads in the past year and are still pursuing a few leads. Until the case is solved, all leads are being pursued," end quote. If you have any information related to the disappearance of Michele Reidenbach, please contact the Pennsylvania State Police at 724-284-8100. Or if you prefer to submit your tip online and or to remain anonymous, you can do so at crimewatchpa.com. There's a Submit a Tip button in the upper right-hand corner on that page. Just give it a click. And now, on to our next case after a short break. A quick heads up. This segment contains mention of sexual assault and discussion of offender behaviors associated with sexually motivated homicide. Please listen with care, and if you'd prefer not to hear about these subjects, we recommend skipping ahead to today's final segment, which tells David Grubb's story. Jennifer Bailey was last seen alive on August 16, 1990. She was 21 years old at the time and lived in Bell County, Kentucky. Bell County is located in the southeasternmost corner of the state along the Tennessee and Virginia borders at the Cumberland Gap. It's a beautiful, mountainous place with a modest population and a wealth of natural beauty. Jennifer, who managed the shoe department at a local Walmart, had the day of her disappearance off work, and she'd begun the day with errands. Her mom, Janice, had recently had surgery and had just been released from the hospital. Jennifer had borrowed her car to go on a trip to the grocery store where she picked up a prescription for her mom as well as some sodas. After that, she rented a movie, Steel Magnolias. She was looking forward to watching it later, but first, she planned to go for a run. At shortly before 11 a.m., she called her mom and let her know that she'd be home as soon as she finished her run. She was heading to a trail in the Pine Mountain State Resort Park, one that was popular with walkers and with runners like her. Jennifer had run the trail, known locally as the Fat Track, before. She was really into fitness and often worked out at the local YMCA where she enjoyed aerobics and weightlifting. Sometimes, though, she preferred to exercise in the fresh air and sunshine and would head to the park to run instead. The day of her disappearance was one of those days. And why not? It was a beautiful day and the park was a beautiful place. She had no reason to suspect danger either. Like I mentioned, the path was popular, well-traveled. The parking lot was even located directly off of US Highway 25 East. In short, for a trail in a state park, it was not particularly secluded or isolated. In fact, according to a 1995 article for the Lexington Herald-Leader, at the time, an average of 73 people jogged the trail every day, and a car passed by the parking lot, on average, every 10 seconds.
Okay, so it's pretty well traveled.
Yeah. Now, despite the popularity of the trail, someone attacked Jennifer there, and they managed to do so without being seen. At least, not during the attack itself. They may have been sighted by witnesses before that. We'll get to that shortly. Meanwhile, while Jennifer was out running, her mom Janice was at home recovering from her recent surgery when, suddenly, she was stricken with a feeling of intense dread. Scott, we've talked about this phenomena before in several other episodes. Call it a mother's intuition or a parent's intuition. We may not be able to explain it, but it's certainly not unheard of. Here's how Janice described what she experienced. Quote, "I was just sitting there, and I will never forget. At noon, straight up and down, this awful fear hit me. It was like someone hitting me in the chest with a hammer. I started screaming and crying, and I went over to my sister and said, 'Something's happened to Jennifer.'" End quote.
I mean, sometimes they just know best. I really have no way to explain how frequently that comes up.
No, but like I said, we've covered it several times before. It definitely happens. Now, as you can imagine, following that, when Jennifer didn't come home at the expected time, her family was seriously worried enough to head out to Pine Mountain State Park and look for her themselves. When they arrived at the parking lot at the trailhead, they found that the car she'd driven was still there, parked and empty. Empty of people, anyway. It was unlocked, so they were able to quickly locate Jennifer's belongings, which she'd left behind. Those belongings included her keys and purse, which she'd stashed under the seat so they wouldn't be left in plain view. Also, there was the prescription and sodas she'd picked up for her mom and the copy of Steel Magnolias that she'd rented. Now, to clarify, it wasn't unusual for Jennifer to leave her car unlocked and her belongings, including her keys, in the car while she ran. She preferred to simply hide her belongings out of sight rather than carry them during her workout. What was unusual was the fact that she hadn't returned to her vehicle. Her run should have been over hours ago, but she hadn't returned from it. The unusualness of this fact, in and of itself, combined with her mother's certainty that something had happened to her, had her family in a state of serious alarm. So they contacted local police and reported her missing. After receiving the report, investigators searched the park, accompanied by volunteers. While the search was occurring, a coworker of Jennifer's was quoted in an article for the Lexington Herald-Leader saying that they hoped Jennifer would show up to the store to pick up her paycheck, which was waiting for her. She never did show up to collect her check, though, and searchers never did find her, despite their efforts. When Jennifer was found 10 days after her disappearance, she was stumbled upon not by searchers, but by a trio of hikers who'd been looking for arrowheads in the Pine Mountain State Park. The hikers found Jennifer's remains in some brush 1.5 miles away from the trailhead parking lot where her car had been parked. According to an article by Cole Sullivan for WBIR News, Jennifer's body had been thrown over a small bluff. Her remains were unclothed, save for her running shoes and some gold chain necklaces she'd been wearing, one of which bore the inscription, "Best Friend." Her body was also found in a sexually suggestive pose, which her killer may have intentionally arranged. Additionally, according to a 1995 article on the case published in the Lexington Herald-Leader, her body had been mutilated. The article doesn't give any specifics regarding the mutilation.
A few things stand out. I'm not surprised about the mutilation if he was throwing her over a small bluff after. The part that did strike me as odd, though, was that if he did dispose of her body in such a way, taking the time to go down and then pose her.
Right. I'm wondering if perhaps he took her down there in the first place to commit the assault against her, where they could get off the trail where somebody wouldn't stumble upon them. I really don't know. Like you, I have a lot of questions about it, but my sources of information were almost exclusively really old newspaper articles, so there are some information gaps I can't fill in.
I'm also wondering if that's where the actual sexual assault happened.
That's one thing I really want to know, but disappointing spoiler alert, I don't. Now, notably, other jewelry Jennifer had been wearing when she'd left for her run, including gold and diamond chip earrings and a Timex watch with a faux crocodile skin band, were missing. So were, of course, her clothes as well as her portable cassette player. Why only some of her jewelry was missing is unknown. It's possible, though, that her killer may have taken those items as souvenirs to remember their crime by. While that behavior is certainly repulsive, it's not uncommon when it comes to cases like this.
No, it doesn't strike me as if he was trying to rob her. Actually, if they didn't really have any unique identifying markers, her attacker could have taken items that were easy to just turn around and flip and sell for money.
True, but I suspect that if robbery had been the motive, they would have taken her earrings, which were made of real gold and diamonds, and the gold chains she was wearing. Those items are a lot more valuable than a Timex watch.
Either way, I think some of it was definitely most likely, like you said, a trophy.
That's my suspicion. Now, because it had been exposed to the summer weather for 10 days, Jennifer's body was in an advanced state of decomposition. Nonetheless, a medical examiner was able to determine that her cause of death had been strangulation. Her manner of death had, obviously, been homicide. Meanwhile, investigators had been pursuing information about Jennifer's disappearance, and numerous witnesses had come forward to report the same thing. On the day of Jennifer's disappearance, they'd seen a woman who'd looked just like her in the parking lot at the trailhead. She'd been arguing with a man who'd been driving a black pickup truck with chrome trim.
Okay.
Now remember, a car passed by on average every 10 seconds, so it's not surprising that we have numerous witnesses coming forward. But of course, all they saw was an argument. It may have stood out to them, but they wouldn't have had a reason to call the police. Now, who exactly that man was is a question that has yet to be answered. Having a vehicle description was helpful, but at the same time, there was no shortage of black pickup trucks in rural Kentucky. There's still not.
I would imagine not.
In a 1995 article on the case published in the Lexington Herald-Leader, a Kentucky State Police detective is quoted saying that whoever was responsible for Jennifer's murder was, quote, going to be tied to a black truck one way or the other. They either own it, or they borrowed it, or their father owned it, or their cousin, end quote. And that's probably true. During the first several years following Jennifer's murder, investigators identified and seriously investigated 10 to 15 different potential suspects. Most of them were local to the Bell County, Kentucky area, but some hailed from farther away, such as one man from Lee County, Virginia. But her killer has yet to be definitively identified, and no one has ever been charged with any crime in relation to her murder. For Jennifer's family, particularly her mom, Janice, this fact has been a source of unimaginable pain. Janice has been quoted in multiple articles over the decades advocating for justice for her daughter. If you read her quotes in those articles, her enduring anguish is obvious. In one of the most recent articles, that one by Cole Sullivan, which was published in 2020, she's quoted saying the following, quote, I am so hurt, so mad, I guess you could say, that nothing's been done. Jennifer was the best child anyone could hope for. Seemed like she got thrown away. Seemed like everybody else threw her away too, end quote. In another one of the more recent articles, this one written in 2018 by Taylor Upchurch, Janice says, quote, I just wish she could see all the blooms in the trees. It will never be solved, I don't believe. I don't believe it will ever be solved, end quote. To the best of my knowledge, at the time of this recording, Janice is still alive, still living with the pain of her daughter's murder, pain that has been compounded by the absence of justice. Jennifer's father has long since passed without ever learning who took his daughter's life. As for Jennifer's killer, if he's still alive, he may very well still be at large. All we know about him is that at the time of Jennifer's murder, he was driving a black pickup truck with chrome trim, and that he probably argued with Jennifer at some point before taking her life. We don't even know whether or not he knew Jennifer. We can, however, make a few educated guesses about him based off of the details of the crime he committed against her. For example, he left her body unclothed and in a sexually suggestive pose. It doesn't take any imagination to conclude that he likely got a sexual thrill out of her death. Additionally, according to a couple of different newspaper articles published in the 1990s, not only was her body posed in a sexually suggestive manner, it had been mutilated. Because they use that word, mutilated, I assume that means that intentional damage done to her body by her killer and not damage done by being tossed over a small bluff or animals outdoors. People don't usually say a body is mutilated when animals have gotten to it. Additionally, her killer seemed to have taken souvenirs from the scene of the crime. These are all classic hallmarks of what's often referred to as a lust murder or a sexual homicide. According to the FBI, lust murders, or sexual homicides, often include severe beating or stabbing of the victim's body, mutilation of the victim's body, and sexually suggestive posing of the victim's body after death. Notably, lust murderers usually kill their victims via strangulation, severe beating, or stabbing. They rarely use firearms. Hands-on methods of killing are often a key component of their crimes, which are based in fantasies that they've entertained for a long, long time. They may select victims of opportunity, springing into action whenever the opportunity presents itself, but make no mistake, even when that occurs, the crimes they commit are something they've fantasized about at length. Among lust murderers, there are generally two types, and you can probably guess what those are: organized offenders and disorganized offenders. You've probably heard those terms before, and sometimes the details of a crime make it easy to tell which type of offender was responsible. Other times, not so much. In Jennifer's case, there's perhaps not enough publicly available information to draw a conclusion on whether or not her killer was organized, disorganized, or somewhere in the middle.
I think a big help to being able to determine that would be whether or not the killer knew her.
Sure. Yeah, those would be helpful things to know. And another thing that you've already pointed out is that we don't know if the fatal assault or the sexual assault or both occurred at the site where her body was found or if it was moved there. And that would be a very telling piece of information. But we, and by we, I mean the public, don't have it. Often, organized offenders, who are the more cunning and intelligent type, will move the victim's body from the location where the murder took place to a secondary location. This doesn't necessarily mean that they'll attempt to conceal the body at the secondary location, though. Sometimes the opposite is true, and they'll intentionally place it where it's likely to be found. But often, transport to a secondary location is part of the crime if an organized offender is responsible.
We've hit on that in the past also.
We have. Now, these offenders, these organized offenders, they're competent, meticulous, and they take measures to avoid being caught. On the other hand, disorganized offenders, who are typically less intelligent, will often leave the body at the scene of the killing, making little to no effort to conceal it. These offenders are impulsive and often leave behind a chaotic crime scene, what's often called a clustered crime scene.
Yeah, I was going to say one of their classic traits is impulsivity, and I personally associate them more with the spur-of-the-moment opportunist.
Definitely.
Because they don't really take the time to plan out what they're going to do. They just do it, and then they are left to try to figure out what to do once that attack has been done.
You're right. They have this emotional reaction. They do this thing they've fantasized about for so long. It's just this explosive, chaotic crime, and then they flee, usually.
They're likely to get caught also.
Yeah, they're a lot more likely to get caught than organized offenders. In Jennifer's case, I wasn't able to locate any information regarding whether or not investigators believe she was killed at the location in which her body was found in the woods or whether it was moved there afterward, like you brought up, Scott. Nor do I know whether her killer used any weapons other than his hands, and if he did, I don't know whether he brought them to the scene or merely seized a nearby weapon of opportunity, such as a rock. Usually, organized offenders bring weapons to the scene of the crime, if they use them at all. Disorganized offenders, contrastingly, often use weapons of opportunity, grabbing whatever is available to them. And there are often other telltale signs that can help investigators determine which type of killer they're dealing with as well. For example, organized lust killers will often penetrate the victim's body with their own, committing what might be considered traditional acts of sexual assault, typically while the victim is still alive. Disorganized lust killers, on the other hand, rarely use their own body to penetrate the victims. They will often subject the victim's body to object penetration instead, and they typically commit any acts of sexual assault or sadism after the victim is already deceased. In Jennifer's case, I don't know which or even whether either of these acts occurred. The information simply hasn't been shared with the public. We can assume from her provocative posing and nudity that she was sexually assaulted, but that's all we can assume. Presumably, though, investigators had that information and all those details, and that's what matters. I bring this unpleasant subject up, though, because when researching Jennifer's case, I found that it's often discussed, especially online, in the context of it potentially being related to the murder of another young woman who was also murdered in Bell County less than 2 years after Jennifer. Her name was Greta Henson, and she was 24 years old. Like Jennifer, she was murdered and her case remains unsolved. However, beyond that, the similarities are limited. Greta was killed in her own home. There were no signs of forced entry, so she may have let her killer in, possibly because they were someone she knew. Or perhaps she had simply left her doors unlocked. Either way, she was attacked. Her attacker bound her hands and feet with zip ties. They also strangled her, although not fatally. What killed her was when they fatally shot her 5 times in the back of her head. The murder weapon is believed to have been a revolver that belonged not to the killer, but to Greta herself. When Greta's killer left, they took a jewelry box of hers with them, and they've never been identified.
Okay, so one thing that stands out is definitely that jewelry box.
Mm-hmm.
And because we were just talking about it, the weapon of opportunity.
Right, a weapon of opportunity. And it makes me suspect that the motive for her killing may have been, and I suspect this based off of the limited information available to me, but may have been robbery. Because They took that jewelry box, they took that revolver, which a lot of the times people will keep a gun like that in their bedroom. What if the person was rifling through her bedroom looking for valuables? What if she'd walked in on them burglarizing her home? Or what if they'd come in with the intent to rob her and it escalated with them deciding to take her life when they found that gun? In any case, Greta was kind, straight-laced, and led a low-risk lifestyle. There was no apparent reason why anyone would have wanted to kill her, which is part of what made her murder so difficult to solve. In that respect, she was a lot like Jennifer. But unlike Jennifer, Greta's killer did not sexually assault her, at least not to the best of my knowledge. There's not a great deal of publicly available information when it comes to Greta's case, but I reviewed a variety of news articles on her murder, ranging from when it happened up to the limited present-day articles. None of them mentioned any sort of sexual element to her murder. No nudity, no sexual assault, no mutilation, no taking of souvenirs from her person. Of course, it's possible that there could have been sexual elements to her murder, but that investigators have kept that under wraps for the past 30-plus years. Unless that's the case, though, I think it's most likely that she and Jennifer were killed by different people. Based upon the publicly available information, Jennifer's death appears to have been a sexually motivated homicide, and Greta's something else. Both killings were cruel, though, and both women are badly missed. If you have any information on the murder of Jennifer Bailey or on the murder of Greta Henson, please call the Kentucky State Police Post 10 at 606-573-3131. And now, on to our next case after a short break. David Grubbs was last seen alive on November 19, 2011. He was 23 years old at the time and lived in Ashland, Oregon. Ashland, with a population of a little over 21,000 people, is located in the southern part of the state, just a short drive from the Northern California border. Statistically speaking, Ashland is a safe place to live. It's also largely considered a very desirable place to live, thanks in part to the fact that the crime rate, especially the violent crime rate, is significantly lower than the national average and the Oregon state average, which is part of what makes what happened to David so unbelievable. When I say that this tragedy shocked the community, I really mean it. Those shockwaves are still echoing, amplified by the lack of explanation for his seemingly random crime of tremendous brutality. David was popular among his peers in his hometown, largely due to his easygoing nature and top-notch sense of humor. He was kind, easy to get along with, and fantastically funny. His coworkers say he was their token funny guy and could get along with just about anybody. He made people laugh, and people loved that about him. He was also a gifted musician. He was passionate about music, and he had good taste. His favorite band was the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
I can appreciate that.
I knew you would, and here's something else you'll appreciate about David Scott. He loved Halloween.
Yes.
In an interview for KOBI5 News, his friends called him the King of Halloween. We should all be held in such high esteem by our friends, right?
I would hope that my friends would consider me that.
Someday, when I'm gone, I hope that my friends and family members don't try to tell any lies about me lighting up a room, which I've never once done in my life, but I do hope they bring up my love of Halloween. David let his talent for making people laugh reign when it came to his iconic Halloween costumes, like the year he was Al Bundy from Married with Children.
Okay, I can appreciate that.
Unsurprisingly, David had plenty of friends. Several of them worked where he did at the Shop and Cart grocery store. On the day of his death, David worked a shift at the store where he stocked shelves. It ended sometime around 5 that afternoon. After clocking out, David did what he always did. He walked home. Ashland is known for its parks, which are connected by greenways. For anyone outside the U.S. or otherwise unfamiliar with the term greenway, it's just used to describe trails that can be used to travel a town or city by foot or by bicycle. For David, the walk from work to home took about 30 minutes via the greenway. Walking was a practical choice. It saved him the expense and hassle of driving to and from work, and it allowed him to get in some exercise. On his way home, David passed by one of the town's parks, Hunter Park to be specific. It encompasses 10 acres or about 4 hectares and includes a swimming pool, sport fields, tennis courts, and a playground. As you can imagine, it's popular with Ashland locals, especially families. Lots of people take their kids there to play, and there's an elementary school nearby that many of those same children attend. Surprisingly, it was in the vicinity of that popular park at a little bit after 5 in the afternoon that David was attacked. A woman riding her bicycle down the greenway was the first to raise the alarm after finding David. 911 dispatched the incident as a person down call, which is exactly what it sounds like, an incident in which a person is found to be physically down, often on the ground or in a vehicle, and unconscious, injured, or impaired in some way. Common causes of person down calls involve medical events, intoxication, drug overdoses, and simple falls or accidents. Usually, when officers and EMS arrive, the person may be in need of medical help, but they're not deceased. This was not a usual person down call, though. It had just gotten dark. It was mid-November, so the sun set early, but when Officer O'Mara of the Ashland Police responded to the scene, it was immediately apparent that the man lying in the greenway, David, he would soon learn, was deceased. And it was clear that his death had been a violent one. O'Mara told Sarah Portney for NBC News that when he arrived on scene, EMS told him, quote, "That guy's definitely dead. It looks like a gunshot wound." End quote. It wasn't a gunshot wound that had taken David's life, though. Rather, he'd been attacked with a bladed instrument, attacked so brutally that actually he'd nearly been decapitated.
So it's not the first time we've heard about that level of violence in one of our episodes, but every time we talk about this, it sounds like overkill. And
right.
I always bring that up.
Definitely it was overkill, but I have to say this is a unique case in that it's the first time we've ever covered one where somebody was walking home from work in the middle of the afternoon and was attacked like this, seemingly at random.
It also seems like a pretty open area.
It was open, very public, and by and large, very safe. Ashland police were baffled by the extreme, seemingly random act of violence. It's believed that David's attacker used either a machete or a sword in the killing.
That's unique.
Right? Although the weapon has never been recovered, we know the blade was at least a foot long. And while either a sword or machete is possible, the statistical odds suggest that a machete is somewhat more likely than the former, simply because most swords owned by modern Americans are more decorative than functional and just wouldn't be sharp enough to carry out such an attack.
Most of what I think of when I hear about an American owning a sword is the kind that you would pick up at the mall.
Yeah, I immediately think mall ninja.
I was just reading a news article where a man attacked some New York City police officers with a machete, so that seems more frequent to me also.
It is, because machetes, on the other hand, are actual cutting tools. Investigators carefully processed the crime scene, collecting evidence under pop-up marquees as rain poured down throughout the night. They also collected David's cell phone for forensic processing. But none of the evidence, physical or digital, pointed to a perpetrator. Investigators had no idea who had attacked David, not when they arrived on scene and not when they finished carefully combing over it. Officer O'Mara, who has since become the chief of Ashland's police force, told journalist Sarah Portney that there was, quote, "no motive thread that we found to pull on. No scorned partner, no beef at work. David was very well liked," end quote. He further stated that the randomness of it is one of the most jarring parts about it.
That's been a common theme throughout all 4 of these episodes, is just how little motive there has been.
Right, and that's why these are episodes that end up being featured in one of our multi-case episodes like this, where the cases have gone cold, because these are tough crimes to solve, and information from the public could be very, very helpful, could even solve the whole case. Just throwing that out there if you know anything. The department poured their resources into the case, questioning dozens of people, David's coworkers, family, friends, and acquaintances, and exploring every aspect of his life, but there was nothing that seemed relevant. They also reached out to other agencies like the FBI for investigative assistance. The agents in the FBI's famous Behavioral Analysis Unit examined the case, but were reportedly unable to provide their usual level of insight. Everyone, it seemed, was at a loss to explain the tragedy. Meanwhile, David's family, friends, and co-workers were devastated, to say the least. And many people around Ashland, understandably, were suddenly afraid to use the greenways. Investigators explored every angle they could think of. They even wondered whether David's murder could have had something to do with a popular video game he'd been playing, Assassin's Creed.
I'm sure you know that I'm a huge Assassin's Creed fan.
Yes, I know. I see the look on your face. Just hear me out.
I need information.
Assassin's Creed Revelations had just released just a few days before David's death. And like millions of other people around the world, David had enjoyed the popular game franchise. For anyone unfamiliar with the games, they're often set in historical times. They feature a lot of adventure, what we would now call parkour in our modern times, and also, of course, swords. Now, it's unlikely that the game had anything whatsoever to do with David's death, but investigators were looking at unconventional places, no matter how unlikely they might have seemed, at least for a while, trying to find an answer to the question, who in the world goes around killing random people with a sword or maybe a machete in 2011? As someone who formerly maintained my department's evidence unit, though, I'll say this. More people than you'd probably imagine walk around with and/or get into trouble with machetes. I used to maintain shelves of weird bladed instruments, including machetes.
I can think of a number of calls that we've had responding to a guy with a machete, and they were just transients walking around with them. No
Yes.
real reason for it.
So some of the machetes in my custody were being kept as evidence in criminal cases, but actually most of the machetes we had were just ones we were holding on to because their owners had had them on their person when they'd been arrested for some other offense, usually nonviolent. So we would hold on to the machete for them within certain time limits until they got out of jail. Once they made bail or finished their sentence, they could come to the PD, retrieve their machete, and go on their way. Now, don't get me wrong, for every one machete or sword we had in our custody, we had dozens and dozens of guns. Machetes are not weapons of choice for most Americans. But, Scott, you've already alluded to this. There is a certain type of American who's more likely to carry a machete. During my time in evidence management, I noticed that the majority of people who carried them on their person were experiencing homelessness. And this makes sense if you think about it. Someone who's experiencing homelessness is obviously experiencing financial hardship, so if they were to possess something as expensive as a gun, they'd likely sell it. A cheap bladed instrument is a much more practical weapon to carry for someone who's in such dire financial straits that they have to worry about where they're going to sleep that night or where their next meal will come from. And it's less likely to be stolen from them, too.
Not to mention, there's also the practical aspect of carrying a machete if you are homeless. You have the ability to potentially help establish some sort of temporary makeshift shelter.
Yeah, literal homeless encampments with tents are very common.
There is that aspect of not only is it a good defensive weapon because you don't have to get as close to someone as you would with a knife, and you don't necessarily have to be as skilled. So it's both practical and purposeful for them to have it, I believe.
Sure. So among the American homeless population, not all of whom carry weapons, but among those who do, bladed weapons in general are king, no question about it. And melee-style weapons like clubs or brass knuckles aren't unheard of either. Guns, though, are very rare. While we're on the subject, it's perhaps worth noting that in many American cities, greenways and the surrounding green areas often attract people who are experiencing homelessness and looking for somewhere to set up camp, like you alluded to, Scott. It's very common, and Ashland is no exception. Actually, Ashland is known for having a significant number of people who pass through the area transiently. So it's possible that David's killer could have been such an individual, but it's far from certain. It's just one possibility. And I want to be clear, people who are experiencing homelessness are a lot more likely to be murdered themselves than they are to fatally attack innocent pedestrians. Being homeless is dangerous, which is one of the reasons why some people experiencing it may choose to carry a weapon on their person. I'll just conclude this section by saying that most people who are homeless are, of course, like most of the rest of us, harmless. Harmless and a lot more vulnerable than those of us who have a safe place to sleep at night. Whether or not David's killer was living transiently or is still in the Ashland area is unknown. Investigators have put David's case into VICAP, the FBI's National Violent Criminal Apprehension Program database, which we've discussed in past episodes. This allows them to be notified if a crime similar to the one committed against David is committed anywhere else in the country, provided that the jurisdiction in which the crime is committed also inputs their crime into the database. So far, this hasn't led to resolution in David's case, but one day it might. VICAP can make a huge difference in connecting crimes that occur in different jurisdictions. There are certainly some closed cases that would likely still be unsolved if it wasn't for VICAP.
More agencies and more officers need to know about and utilize VICAP.
Absolutely. I could get up on my soapbox about that one for a while. Resisting that urge, at some point during the course of the past dozen years, investigators were able to identify a potential person of interest in relation to David's murder, a man named Christian De Laurentiis.
Okay.
De Laurentiis is, according to that article by Sarah Portney, quote, currently serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole for aggravated murder and first-degree abuse of a corpse in an unrelated case, end quote. The part that stands out to me is with the possibility of parole for aggravated murder and first-degree abuse of a corpse? You ever think about letting that person back out on the streets?
It's not encouraging, but I'll stay off of my poor decision-making by the justice system.
Look, in America, we incarcerate way too many people. It's horrible. And then you have somebody like this, who I think we can all look at his crime, which I'll tell you about here in a moment, and be like, you know what? He probably doesn't need to be out among the rest of us. At the time of David's murder, De Laurentiis was living in the area and was severely addicted to heroin. He had a habit of robbing banks to fund his drug use, but those robberies were tame compared to the crime that landed him in prison for life. In 2012, De Laurentiis stabbed his roommate, a man named Philip, to death, dismembered his body, and stashed the remains in a freezer.
A bit more aggressive than a bank robbery.
And not to be graphic, and yes, I think this makes it even worse, dismembered it into very small pieces. He spent a lot of time on this gross act. It's not difficult to see why De Laurentiis caught investigators' attention in regards to David's case, but according to that article by Sarah Portney, De Laurentiis has refused to speak to investigators about David's case, and they don't have any physical evidence against him at all, so they're more or less stuck in limbo regarding him as a potential suspect. Whether or not he was involved in David's death, or had ever even laid eyes on David at any point, is unknown for now, and De Laurentiis is the only person of interest who police have publicly named. When it comes to other possibilities regarding suspects, some have wondered whether David's killer might have been someone who was literally out of their mind, that is, detached from reality, when they attacked him. While the random and heinous nature of this crime makes the appeal of this theory obvious, who wants to think that somebody in their right mind would do something like this? It doesn't seem like the most likely explanation.
It doesn't. I mean, we were recently just talking about how certain drug use affects people's minds differently, and you may have no clue what you're doing, but...
Sure, certain drug use, certain mental illnesses, there's a lot of things that can cause a psychotic break. I say that a psychotic break doesn't seem like the most likely explanation because whoever killed David fled the scene, which was on a well-traveled public path, taking the murder weapon with them, then presumably cleaned themselves up and managed to conceal the fact they were responsible for a very gory murder. And they've been concealing that fact for a dozen years now. Individuals suffering from psychotic breaks generally don't have the mental wherewithal to immediately conceal their involvement in a crime. In fact, in such a situation, they won't even realize they've committed a crime.
Yeah, many times they are right there on the scene alongside the victim.
Frequently, yes. While it's obviously safe to say that David's killer was a disturbed individual, to say the least, they likely were aware of what they were doing when they committed the crime. David's death and the lack of answers in its wake has been a tremendous source of agony for his friends and family, especially his mom, Sherry. In 2014, Sherry told journalist Christine Pitawanich that she believes David's murder was a random act. She also told her that, quote, "I don't see joy in my life anymore, because when good things happen, I know how quickly they can be taken away," end quote.
It's a somber reality to live with.
Yeah, I can see why she feels that way. I imagine a lot of parents would feel that way if this happened to their child. In another frank statement, she said that she struggles daily and that as life goes on in Ashland, she has to fight the urge to walk up to people, shake them, and say, "There's a murderer out there." When it comes to Ashland, though, it's something that Sherry eventually had to leave behind, trading it for life in the nearby town of Talent. Ashland is a desirable and increasingly expensive place to live. Sherry, who's a retired nurse, eventually could no longer afford the cost of residing there, and so she moved. Tragically, in 2020, a wildfire destroyed her new home in Talent. Before it hit the neighborhood, with her daughter and neighbors' help, she was able to salvage a few vital items from her home. Those vital items included precious, tangible reminders of David, things like a childhood drawing of his and a program from his memorial service.
Things that would be irreplaceable today.
Yes. In an effort to obtain tips from the public, the Ashland Police Department has put up a reward for information leading to an arrest in David's case. At the time of this recording, it stands at $22,000. Investigators say they want any piece of information anyone has, no matter how small or potentially insignificant it may seem. So please, if you have any information whatsoever related to the death of David Grubbs, call the Ashland Police Department at 541-552-2333. Or, if you'd prefer to remain anonymous, you can call or text Crime Stoppers of Southern Oregon at 1-800-850-0580.
That's all for this special multi-case episode of Last Day in Life. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastinginlifepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta and Twitter at LSA Podcast. New episodes of Last Day in Life go live every other Monday. See you then. If you think bringing unsolved cases like these to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Day in Life and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Last Day in Life is written and researched by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.